As you mentioned, I'm the Director of Research Parks for the MSU Research Foundation. We are focused on economic development, real estate, venture creation, venture studio, and supporting all things economic development on behalf of MSU for the state of Michigan, for more closely the Lansing region, and then anything that the kind of the light touches for MSU. And in that, we have been kind of the lead on, John, there's a seat down here. We've been the lead on things like the EDA Tech Hub initiative, the NSF Engine Grant, and a lot of the resources that are starting to hit those two lines where university and innovation and community kind of cross. One of the successful efforts we've been able to launch is the Tech Hub effort. So we applied this, I guess we started applying this time last year for it. And Tech Hub was an effort of the Academic Development Administration to create different tech hubs, technology hubs across the United States that were focused on one of 10 key technology focus areas. And in those 10, you had to kind of identify what your competitive strengths were. And for MSU, we have lots of competitive strengths. We could have probably applied for all 10. But when we zeroed in on it, what we found is that we have a workforce here, we have a capacity here, and we have competitive advantage in synthetic diamond and particle accelerators. Probably better than anyone in the world. Definitely better than anyone in the United States. So as you start to narrow in on that, zoom in on that, the workforce component becomes a serious element to growing an economy around those areas. And why does that matter? Well, if you're going to focus on economic resilience in the United States and onshoring and bringing back the supply chain for things so you don't run into this chip manufacturing issue that they had for years, you really need to identify, is the workforce capable of building that out for you? And in the greater Lansing region, we have absolutely the workforce to do that. We are not focused on eds and meds, and that this is a benefiting few. This is a benefiting all. And this is a very targeted, focused effort on shared prosperity. That our goal is to raise the tide for everyone in this region, and that this is a long tail discussion of how we make that happen. So I'll give you the update where we're at right now, and then I'll give you the update on where our community benefits plan sits. And Sam actually knows this intimately because he was one of the potential vendors for the community benefits plan for us. We have not yet secured it, but we are working toward it. I won't give you all the details on what a community benefits plan will enable, but I will kind of focus on what our focus is on. There isn't one for the Lansing region. How many are there in the state?
How many?
Community benefits ordinances.
Detroit and Ypsilanti.
Yeah, two that we've identified thus far.
Yeah, I can't think of anything else other than those. It is only as good as the community that enables it. So having one in Lansing but not one in East Lansing doesn't make a lot of sense. Having one in East Lansing and not in any of the other areas that the effort might impact doesn't make any sense. Having one countywide would make an incredible amount of sense. Because projects don't operate in a vacuum, and that the economy doesn't operate in a vacuum. So let's go through the update real quick of where we're at with what we call the MARS Consortium, and that's materials advancement for research strategies, specifically on synthetic diamond and particle accelerators. So this is very fresh. This is something that went out to the consortium members. This is the new logo. This is what you'll see on letterhead. This is what you hopefully will see on buildings soon. But this is, again, touching on what our focus is on synthetic diamond particle accelerators, but really how this applies in the greater scheme, it's semiconductor chips, power electronics, defense and aerospace industry, components, advanced materials. Does anybody have a synthetic diamond? Does anybody have a CVD diamond on their finger or on their neck? It is becoming a lot more common, actually.
It's
I
trending
would.
with the new generation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the blood diamond approach to things has forced us into creating them ourselves. They're 99% more pure. They're able to be grown in a lab. They don't require labor, like really brutal labor. And we happen to make the machines that make the diamonds right here in East Lansing. So CVD diamonds were invented by the machines that make them were invented by a MSU professor. So they're the intellectual property and the entire commercialization spectrum was made here. Who knew? And so we have companies that have used that technology to grow diamonds and to create an industry. And in that process have hired a massive amount of people. There's a company called Great Lakes Crystal Technologies that are located here in town that are making diamonds right now and are doing them at a scale and a quality that could be used for quantum computing, defense, lasers, satellites, sensors, whatever it might be. They're hiring anyone and everyone. And it isn't that you have to have a higher ed degree, you don't have to have an advanced degree, it's that you have to understand that this is how we go about it, this is the process, and please don't take that hydrogen and turn it into something explosive. But it's something that anybody can be a part of, and that's what we're finding to be an incredible opportunity for us. So, this is our timeline. We kind of launched, and I apologize if this isn't in, I'll try to explode this a little bit here. Expand the screen a little. A little easier to see.
Is this in PDF though?
Yeah,
If you go Control L, I think that makes the PDF full screen.
see if it works. Thank you.
You're welcome. I had to learn the hard way.
I hope that's even large enough for those that are online to see. But this isn't intended to be a drill down into any of these categories, but it does give you a sense of where we're at on timelines. So in October of last year, they announced that we were finalists and that we were likely going to receive funding. It wasn't until late January, early February that we were actually able to take award. This is not millions of dollars. This is $400,000 in total funding for an economic development strategy, an implementation plan, a community benefits plan, and a general preliminary engineering report. That's not a lot of money. What we're hoping that we could do is stretch those dollars as thin as possible and leverage it to compound on each other and get us to where we can leverage it for additional federal funding. So you'll see in activity one, the community or the consortium development and activation, that's really just bringing on a layer to kind of activate and bring around all those groups to make those things happen. And this extends 15 different organizations across the state of Michigan. Activity two, the strategic planning and the focus group development. This is more of your technology, economic development strategy and implementation plan. And then finally, or after the preliminary engineering report, which will come after, but the community benefits plan will be a part of that kind of strategic planning and focus group development. These things have to happen in some sort of reasonable sequence so that you don't end up with, here's what we think the implementation of the economic development strategy will take place. Oh, and by the way, here are all the other economic strategies around equity, inclusion, and sustainability and energy focus. It can't happen that way. They have to kind of web into each other. So these things are happening in real time right now with multiple different vendors and consultants to make it happen. So I'll drill into the strategic planning and focus group to develop this focus group development. Again, in identify and engage a contractor, develop the community benefits plan, then the economic development strategy, then the implementation strategy. These are all that's kind of the order and sequence of how this is going to go down. Okay, so that is where we're at from an activity standpoint. And again, The vendors are being selected as we speak. We're meeting and interviewing them now. So I'm gonna also share a different document which drills into the actual community benefits plan. Control L. Let me zoom in a little bit. I'm sure that that is a control plus, maybe. Hey, that was a good guess. Does that work? Oh, hold on. I'll stop and share this other one. Let's share this. Okay. So quick show of hands, Department of Energy Justice 40 initiatives. Has anybody heard or read any of them? Okay, not many. Okay, so a few. All right. So the community benefits plan ties back to a lot of the Justice 40 initiatives from the Department of Energy, which really identifies we're not going to do this for the select and for the few anymore. This has to be for everybody. And we're also going to focus on, long-term sustainable goals, but we're doing it for Ingham, Eaton, Clinton, and Shiawassee counties. Again, community benefits plans work really well, and the larger out the jurisdiction goes, or geography goes, we will not be able to dictate that that happens for all 4 counties. We are setting up what could be a template and a master plan for Lansing to adopt, but also for East Lansing to adopt and for so on and so forth. The effort that we have going right now and the interest that we have going right now is specific to Lansing. We have a very specific site identified. We have a very specific effort underway. We are in the middle of due diligence for that effort. So the focus for this is for the city of Lansing, but this is a template that could be used in other cities. And hopefully will be. We are not asking for this to be adopted as ordinance. The community benefits plan will happen prior to the ordinance. So we'll develop something that'll be a framework that the ordinance could be adopted off of. It will be entirely up to the city of Lansing, in case anybody's a Lansing voter. To put the pressure, to put pressure on the city of Lansing to adopt it.
Vote early.
Vote early, vote often, right? We will be doing it in enough of a timeline that it could potentially be adopted fall. We'll be done with our efforts in the end of June, early July, which is a very short timeline for all of this. Again, we don't have millions of dollars to spend on this. We have a very short amount of time. We have a very small budget to get through this. But hopefully we'll be done in time for enough review to happen that it could potentially be in November. That's wishful thinking.
Jeff, sorry to interrupt. Do you have any expectation that it won't get adopted? I mean, you were saying go put pressure on. Are you worried?
Depends on what they say in the plan.
Okay.
It could be that you're asking a lot. So, in other markets, and I know other markets are looking at this, community benefits plan was an alternative to a pilot. I'm not going to call out the community. I'll just say, Geography X, we're asked to put together a pilot by the universities. We're asked to put in a payment in lieu of taxes to help subsidize and provide investment into a community. Maybe there was a project going in, the neighborhood around it was saying, hey, what about us? And so that there was a request to put in a payment in lieu of taxes to help support that neighborhood around it. Those could be one-off efforts, and typically are. This is saying every time there's an effort happening, there's going to be some investment made to adjacent properties and to adjacent efforts. That could be a lot of pressure for a community and for the developer to say that this is going to happen. A lot of developers might say this isn't going to happen. A lot of communities might say this is going to stall and stymie projects in our community. When in reality, once you have something that everybody can agree to, everyone should be able to play by the same rules and move forward. So I'm not saying that there isn't interest. I'm just saying it could be considered a disincentive to some, and that could mean that there's no vote to support it. So what is it that we're asking for? And I'll break down the scope of work. Community needs assessment. this is something that, what are the challenges that the Lansing region is facing? Engage with stakeholders, including residents, local organizations, authorities, and gather insights and feedback. This could take a while. It should take a while. Develop a strategy for ongoing engagement with those stakeholders to ensure that the input continues throughout implementation. So this is something that will be in place up to the point when the ordinance is adopted. And hopefully that it's convened by a group that makes sense to convene it. Group like this, coming around the table and saying, we are going to insist that it happens, or that we're going to insist that it's being heard. We're not going to be able to march on City Hall and say, we're going to demand that this happen. What we're saying is, we're going to put together a framework that someone could easily do that with. And hopefully we'll do that with. Process and develop programs that are Lansing region specific. Templates work well if geographically are located near each other. You can't take something in, New Jersey, Morristown, New Jersey, and apply it here and expect it to work well. It's going to be very Lansing region specific of what is expected. This is bringing in the labor unions. This is bringing in all the varying chambers. This is bringing in the neighborhood associations and workforce agencies to really identify how do we make this happen for everybody. And then, bullet 2, and then bullet 3, an action plan for developing what that might look like, metrics, reporting and evaluation, put together that actual kit. This is how we measure the success. This is how we measure whether or not we're moving the needle. And is this actually going to work? And then budget and resource allocation. How are we going to pay for it? How is it going to continue to stay funded? And how are people going to support it long term? Ordinances are great. But if it cannot make money, or if it stymies development, if it looks like it's gonna be a barrier and a serious impediment to moving forward, it will get pushed to the side and will no longer be active. So it has to have a long-term strategy that works from a financial standpoint. So that's where we're at from a community benefits plan. Love any questions on any of that. Yeah.
What would be the pushback you'd expect? Like, what makes us not just a no-brainer with council or mayor?
It wouldn't necessarily be pushback, but it might be, when you start casting a big net, there's some that might feel like they weren't included in it. And if this is intended to be all inclusive, but you're very well going to run into a situation where it didn't include all of the groups that it should have. And that's what I hope doesn't happen, is that we try to get the word out enough during the process to make sure that we're, touching every corner.
Hey, any other
So-
questions? Oh, sorry.
I know you had alluded to how it really only works well if, in Michigan, how we have so many different layers of government that surround the metropolitan area, but you said it worked well if it's countywide, maybe not if it's one municipality or another. We also have the unique benefit in our region that we have 3 counties that have very varying levels of philosophy, ideology. Do you, from what you've put together so far, from your experience, do you feel that there would be enough support for benefits ordinance
This tri-county.
among all the counties?
Maybe not right away. I think there are steps that this region's taking that we're seeing nationally that are leading towards a county level executive. And I'm saying that, meaning that there should be a Ingham County executive. There should be a Clinton County executive, there should be a Eaton County executive, and that would make things a lot easier moving toward a county level effort. If you're leading this down a path based on county commissioners, you're going to continuously find yourselves politicizing it. And it shouldn't be a political discussion. It should be that, you know, this is what is the best for everyone. I mean, shared prosperity should be how we approach all of this. But it'll be a political effort if we don't have some sort of county level executive. And that's probably another recommendation that isn't a part of our plan.
Is there, do you see in other areas any efforts to, because a lot of times the difference in policy and maybe support has a lot to do with urban versus agricultural or rural areas. Is there any supports that you see in other areas of the nation where there would be some sort of auto annexation or some sort of creation of an urban area, like if you're on municipal services, this gets empowered? Do you know what I'm?
I do.
Getting at?
I do. I have not seen that happen, but I'm not an expert on national, I don't know all of them. I don't know that this will go that far. Either. I think this will go as far as putting something in place. Is anybody tracking what's happening in Detroit at the Henry Ford project and seen any of the billboards that say benefiting who? I don't know if anybody's seen that.
That would be
Down 75.
Sam's expertise.
Yeah.
But those aren't our billboards, just so people know.
That is
Yeah, yeah.
a clear shot across the bow at Michigan State and the efforts happening with Henry Ford. Asking for an incentive on a project where there is a community benefits ordinance and you haven't really communicated how it's going to benefit the community. They hadn't at that point. We don't want that to happen. We don't need that to happen. It shouldn't happen. If we're trying to be conscious of doing it ahead of schedule here. We want to,
Yes, so I have the pleasure of serving as a developer in the project for MSU, working for the Office of Health Sciences. But there was at least a year worth of engagement with the community. And it involved canvassing the neighborhoods, it involved hosting business roundtables, engaging with high school students, in addition to working with organizations within the impact area, which the census tract was created by the city of Detroit. So it wasn't very easy to reach everyone, but I will say that we did go full force with outreach and engagement, even introducing tours, and a lot of our presentations were based off of the feedback and the surveys that we did provide with the community groups so that we can have some input into what they were looking for out of the project.
yeah. So the EDA is, the Economic Development Administration is providing some input on how to take next steps on these things. So that seems like a very thought out, very deliberate, very effort focused community benefits strategy. I think what we're finding and what we're hearing is that it has to go a lot further than that. In fact, the EDA sent us during our review, here are 5 things that we're hearing in plans and 5 things that we should be hearing in plans. And those 5 things were strive towards 75 new jobs, either semi-permanent or permanent. Create a K-12 education program to get students in and expose them to the industry of the opportunity. I mean, those are just a couple of examples. The 5 that they're saying that we need to adopt are, there needs to be an economic development officer that reports directly to the president at the university. That's a sea change for universities. There has to be in Philadelphia, there's something called Science Center. And Science Center is a lab to, well, I guess it's classroom to lab program where they take members of the community, doesn't matter who they are, and they put them through a 30-day program in a lab, gets them a lab certification and gets them lab trained. then places them in a position with one of the companies that are part of the ecosystem. So now the company has fulfilled a position, the individuals are then credentialed, and they have, they go from, $12.50 an hour to about $30 an hour, and they could show that very clear wage impact. And they're doing this by the hundreds. I know Philadelphia is a much different market than us. But a lot of the companies we're talking about are lab-related companies. All of them need lab managers, all of them need lab technicians, all of them need lab hands. And like I mentioned with Great Lakes, they aren't necessarily higher ed positions. These are not necessarily being filled by individuals with, even a 2-year degree. These are individuals that are getting trained and then performing very quickly.
I feel like a lot of what I'm hearing you say is like there's a communication barrier along with a lot of this, like with how people hear about these awesome innovative things that are happening. And then on the, community benefit side of things, like the community engagement needing to be long-term, intentional, all of those things, but then, actually communicating in a way that reaches people that don't get the human face-to-face opportunity or on the, like connections to the actual jobs or training, really getting people to understand it's not just this big fancy science like synthetic diamond, but like I have a place in this. Has that been something that you guys have considered in part of like the planning process? Cause I think that's, I guess, spanning all corners of the discussion.
Yeah, so we're gonna put the word out as best we can. But until there's a gate saying this has to happen for everyone, not just us, not just MSU, not just any of these, one-off projects, but everyone, then it isn't something that's gonna be widespread and widely known, because it'll just be something else that is put out there that we're doing, we're not gonna do, job fairs are great, but that is only going to hire 50 to 75 people, and it's always, these are the jobs we're looking to fill. That isn't really training a whole new generation of people to do something. There has to be a line saying, until this line is in place, this is the plan, and once the line is in place, everyone is adhering to it. Every project that happens in the Lansing region, every single effort and every dime we spend has to consider these 7 criteria. And if those things aren't met, it's not happening. I mean, all this discussion with the city hall and ovation and everything else around it, it's only because there isn't a set of requirements that are in place. If those requirements are all met, there shouldn't be any discussion at all.
Let's just take one more question, and then we want to get on to our other panelists.
This is fascinating, thank you
Yeah.
for that. I'm just struck by the fact that a community benefits plan being developed in some ways by a developer as opposed to the community. I mean, that's a real twist, and I'm loving to see it done. I've got a whole lot of other questions, but I just have one. So in terms of elected officials, right, folks who are going to have to make the decision about this policy, if you will, or ordinance, how have they been engaged up to this point?
They don't really know about it. And unless you're in Detroit or FC, you probably have no idea what a community benefits plan is. There may be some elected officials, maybe as you move up the geographic ladder, you might find that they're gonna start being aware of it. Justice 40 has been around enough and around long enough for it to be it's kind of permeating. And if you want to get funded at all, you're going to have adopted something at a federal level. And so, they're going to have to know about it soon.
And that's the local folks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, folks. I get the rest of the panelists and then we can do some more dialogue.
Great, thanks.
Share screen, yeah. Unmute.
Oh, yes, unmute.
Okay, muted.
You don't need to.
Oh, it picks up. Okay. Yeah, actually that looks like that creates feedback. Oh no, how do I go back to muting myself? Okay. All right, well, Oh, I think I need to mute, yeah. There we go.
Okay, I did it. Yeah, thank you. So it's great to be here. I'm Sarah Reckow and I'm a faculty member in the political science department at Michigan State. And I started doing research on community benefit agreements in 2019. And at the time, it didn't feel like there was a lot of interest in this topic, and I wrote a paper about it. I collected all this data, and now 5 years later, it's exciting that there is interest. And so I'm going to share some of the kind of national context from the data that I collected, some of the background on how these emerged, and some of the politics of how they emerged, which might also speak to some of the questions that have already been asked based off of Jeff's presentation. So a little bit of background here is to keep in mind the issue of economic development as sort of the setting where all of this is happening, and that we have economic development incentives, which are very popular with politicians. This idea that you can credit claim and say, we've recruited this company, here's this ribbon cutting, rah, rah, rah. And so for just one data point here, survey of mayors, mayors say, yes, recruiting companies with financial incentives is good policy. And so that's been, long the case as sort of this routine part of our economic development policy at both the state and the local level. But we've also had some infamous examples that have led to more political critiques of this approach. I have the newspaper photo up there from the New York Post of Jeff Bezos hanging out of a helicopter with money bags. But if you remember all the hoopla around Amazon HQ2, I think that definitely brought to a lot of people's attention, what the heck is going on here? Why are people throwing money at the richest person in the richest company? This incredibly, so to kind of add to this is a few critiques. So one is this question, like, are incentives even very good policy? A lot of the research suggests that they're not. We have Tim Bartik at Upjohn Institute who constantly churns out things on this. And I mean, one of the biggest things is that they often don't necessarily produce the jobs that are predicted or promised. But politicians still like them. And they can be there's this sort of backroom dealing aspect that I think a lot of people sense out of it, that okay, these are benefits that are channeled through the tax code. It's not explicitly adopted as policy sometimes. And the negotiations traditionally have happened in the local context between, say, the city and the developer. And so a lot of what the community benefits process in part is about is, should other people be in the room? Should other people be around the table when these discussions are taking place? And the big question, who benefits? So my research that I'm going to share today touches on a few things. One is just this question about subsidies, and do cities lose money to subsidies? And that's something that in some cases, the way incentives and subsidies get talked about, it's like, no, it's not lost money. We get it, but it's not, we're not, it's a tax incentive. So it's not, you're potentially not collecting these particular taxes, but we'll get it back later, that sort of thing. But I want to touch on that specific question. And then secondly, this larger question about community benefit agreements. So how have negotiations over subsidies started to include more interests and debates? And then with some data I collected nationally on where community benefit agreements have been negotiated, what political and economic factors of communities predict where we see CBAs actually happening. So on this topic of the revenue losses, one thing that really drew attention to the notion that incentives or tax abatements are revenue losses is actually a change in the accounting rules for cities. So there is a document that cities, you can find this on city websites, it's called their Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. It's put together by accountants every year for city governments, and they have to report all sorts of things about their revenues and their taxes and how they spend their money. Well, what's known as the GSAB, General Accounting Standards Board, several years back said, hey, starting now, cities, you're going to be required to report revenue losses to subsidies. So the accountant suddenly said, this matters. These are revenue losses. And the claim basically was that tax abatements can have a substantial effect on government's ability to generate revenue and their overall fiscal health. Trouble with this is that cities have taken a while to comply with the reporting, so the compliance is extremely spotty, even though it is the expectation of this board that tells cities how to do their accounting. But just to give you a overall figure from this, in 2017, the first year it was reported, 78 cities reported 2.35 billion in losses. Some of the largest, one that I know is Kansas City. So this issue of incentives happening on state borders where, you know, Kansas and Missouri are competing with each other over businesses, I think that kind of gets highlighted there. But to bring it to Michigan, this is some data I pulled from the reports for some of the largest per capita revenue losses reported in Michigan cities. And notice that Detroit for 2019 was reporting 20.6 million in revenue losses to subsidies, which amounts to $33 per capita. So maybe not a huge amount on a per capita basis, but when you're talking about a city that went through municipal bankruptcy, you know, maybe that adds to the point that this is something worth discussing further. And so some of the policy discussion has started to consider the trade-offs of, you know, okay, if we're making this decision that allows a company to build and they get some public support, even if it's in the form of tax abatements, should we see more public benefit out of those projects? So what I decided to do was try to identify and track all the community benefit agreements that have been negotiated in the US over time. And I have to admit, this data, I stopped collecting it in 2020. So I don't have all the things that have happened in the last 4 years, which includes a lot of activity in Detroit, for example. But I can tell you, you know, what was the case up until 2020. So the first CBA was in Los Angeles. It was the LA Live project, a major subsidized entertainment district, if you've ever been there. And the community benefit agreement touched on a lot of things that I think you see occur frequently across these agreements: affordable housing, local hiring, living wage. That being said, you know, these agreements are so specific, community to community and place to place and to project. And sometimes they're negotiated with developers and nonprofits in the city. Sometimes there's multiple nonprofits involved. Sometimes there's unions involved as well. The cities that have the most CBAs in the United States are Detroit, Los Angeles, and New York City. But as you can see from the graph, it really did take off in that latter decade of the, you know, up to 2020. And this is, and I apologize for sharing the statistical model, but I'll just break this down and summarize. So what I did was I took my data on where the CBAs are located, and then I took a lot of other data about characteristics of those cities, political characteristics, demographic characteristics, to try to figure out what makes you more or less likely to have a CBA in your city. And this maybe speaks to some of the questions about like our local context and where might we end up with a CBO ordinance, and what about a place like Shiawassee County? Because some of the things that are most associated with having a CBA are having a population that is more liberal ideologically. Very strong predictor of having CBAs. Union membership, very strong predictor of having CBAs. Additionally, more Black population and Latino population, strong predictors of CBAs as well. This, again, talking about the urban piece, seems to also go with more urban areas as well. Notice that the revenue losses to subsidies is not a predictor, and kind of what I'd say here is, well, lots of communities are doing incentives. Incentives are happening everywhere. Abatements are happening everywhere. Not every community seems to have the politics that leads to this whole negotiation process and engages broader community. I'm gonna not touch on this next slide too much because Sam is the expert, I think, much more so on Detroit. But just to say that, you know, Detroit, I think, is a really important case in understanding the story, because it was the first city to adopt a community benefits ordinance. So to go from this sort of piecemeal project to project approach to negotiating, where anytime there might be incentives, if organizations wanted to see an agreement come about, they had to go after that one project. The city has a citywide process for that. I have some timeline points here on the context for that, sort of thinking about it in the context of the bankruptcy and the political mobilization that led to the CBO ordinance happening in Detroit, which was a lot of political groundwork by community-based groups in the city of Detroit, including the Equitable Detroit Coalition, and really highlighting the inequality that's so important and present to understanding politics in Detroit and the racial dimensions of that inequality as well. Just to wrap up here, the general conclusions I want to share are that there are these features of cities being more liberal, more union membership, and more Black and Latino residents that we see associated with having CBAs. There is one other city, Ypsilanti, that they adopted their community benefits ordinance in 2018. And I think, going forward, and this is probably what Sam will be able to speak to a lot more, is about the specifics of these negotiations within the city, the groups that get involved. Do people feel involved in the process? And I know it's still, I think, a very live debate in Detroit, whether there should be changes to that process. But it does, I think, to the point about the history of incentives, we've taken a process that happened behind closed doors, we've opened it up, and so we should expect that to be very messy and contentious, as politics often is. So, thank you.
Shall we take a couple questions for Professor Rakoff? Any questions? Dr. Brooke.
Hey, thank you, also. Is there capital investment, the level of it or amount of it, does that play a role? Right, so if I think about Detroit, you got all those other factors, but then there has been a significant amount of capital investment that's like really changing the community. Is that playing a role?
Yeah.
Why you might see it versus where you might not?
That is a great question, and unfortunately, I didn't look at that, so I can't, just say an answer in terms of the national context. I can say anecdotally that really rings true, because I did, in the process of collecting these data, basically, I have a list of all those CBA projects, and I was downloading all the agreements, and yes, these are very often sparked by very large scale areas, sort of the capital intensive having a stadium project go in, things that I think it's partly the politics and attention, where we might have the more routine politics of subsidies, but then something very eye-popping is coming into a community, and that helps draw out the mobilizing, the organizing, the view that this project should benefit a broader part of the community. That does seem to be a big part of it, yeah.
In the research triangle in North Carolina, you see the beginnings of it, and there's a lot of capital investment, big projects like that. And for the community, they're starting to now say, oh, wait a minute, right? What's in it for us? And that's generating. So both, the need as well as the investment. So
yeah.
For your chart of the community benefit agreements, that's just one-off projects, like the growth in one-off projects?
Yeah, it's a growth in, because the ordinances are very uncommon. I mean, Detroit was the first, and that wasn't until 2016. So the approach of making it a policy is really new. And so you're mostly looking at these, exactly, one-off. And so it has, very dependent on some political mobilization to demand it, or it doesn't happen. Yeah.
I feel like this is an important question, but how are these enabled? I mean, or I guess, how are they different from like development exactions, or is it tied to incentives only? I remember trying for impact fees 20 years ago. It's like, this is not possible here. So I guess I'm wondering how, like, is there legislation that allows these to be, or how is it different from an exaction or contract zoning? How do these happen?
That is a great question. And you're right. I mean, it is true that you always had that the city developer piece, right? And yeah, impact fees, right? This idea that, oh, something should be paid it's, I can't speak to the issue of impact fees specifically here, but it does seem to come out of the idea that in a lot of places, people felt the city wasn't negotiating enough on behalf of the community or on behalf of disadvantaged parts of the community. And so people to represent that needed to be at the table. Right, so but then, yeah, there are some questions about sort of the, I guess, legally binding aspects of these contracts, right? They're written in contract language, they are contracts. That being said, they don't always get followed. And there's some, other people have done some research on that, but there's a lot of questions and problematic aspects about CBAs not being followed and whether there is anything you can do down the road if the agreement isn't followed.
I can speak a little bit to that. There are a lot of ways to disincentivize the incentive if they aren't followed. So you can release only the amount of funding for the amount that they are actually adhering to. You can, in the reverse, so if it's a tax credit that they're receiving, or if there's something at the end, that there's a carrot on the end that they'll receive if they adhere to it. If they don't, let's say they go all out and they do everything that they can possibly do, but they can't hit the number that they're trying to. Maybe it's hire 140 people from the local community or from the local neighborhoods, and there isn't that many people to hire. There's a direct proportion to how much then they have to pay back to how much that is. Maybe they pay down the amount, but there's plenty of ways to make it happen.
So I guess along those lines, then is it always tied to incentives?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess that maybe answer my question is, if you're only allowing the CBA in questions where or in situations where there's incentive in place, then you're not requiring it for just those that have incentives. Is that accurate?
So
I think to the point, I think there's almost every project anymore has some sort of incentive tied to it. Maybe it's a variance.
House now. Right?
Yes,
Oh.
maybe it's a variance, maybe it's you're asking for, some flexibility and special use. Maybe you're getting federal funding to do the project. That federal funding will have the same incentives tied to it that every other incentive will. Cool. Thank you.
So I would actually love to jump in on this topic, and I can address it during my presentation, but the question related to how is this not contract zoning, or how is this not considered like some sort of like exaction? I think it really gets to the heart of the matter, right? Because there are many what I would call community benefit related ordinances that are embedded in city approval processes across the country, right? And as cities have written those into law, they always have to like kind of make sure that they're not running afoul of like Nolan Dolan precedent which is like a US Supreme Court precedent, right? So like, I am not a lawyer, but to sort of just give a very, very high level gist, you can require certain community benefits if you can make an argument that those benefits directly addressed an externality caused by the project. So in Santa Monica, they have a pretty robust community benefit ordinance related to affordable housing. And they legally have been able to draw that bright line between, if you are developing in this area, that creates a burden on affordable housing, and therefore you need to compensate for that. Where municipalities have a lot more leeway is if they are tying it to incentives, because then the legal argument is that the city is acting as just a market actor, and they can, do pretty much whatever they want, as long as they're just acting as a normal market actor. So that is why you normally see these things tied to incentives, but they don't necessarily have to be. Is that helpful? Sorry, Sarah, I didn't mean to steal your thunder there. Yeah.
East Lansing has 1% for art, right? In a lot
Yeah,
of
I mean,
ways.
Southfield has a public art ordinance as well. And I actually don't tell anybody. I scratched my head at that Southfield ordinance. I'm like, how did that pass legal muster? But I love it. I love public art. So yeah, keep it.
So let's share screen. Let's Sam, do you have slides you want to share with us?
Sure. Sarah, I feel bad. Did I cut you off? Are you
Oh,
okay?
not at all. Yeah.
Unless you can pick up questions afterwards.
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I will share my screen. I just got too excited, had to jump in there about that. Well, first, let me just thank MSU for having me, and thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Jeff, for going first. I mean, both of your talks were fascinating, and I really want to continue the conversation. My name is Sam Butler, and I'm executive director of a nonprofit in Detroit called D4, which stands for Doing Development Differently in Metro Detroit. We're a nonprofit that was started a little over 10 years ago, dedicated to what we call equitable development. But also we were started kind of with the charge of taking this community benefits movement that was emerging from New York, LA, and applying it to Detroit, and really figuring out how can we continue that movement and what adjustments do or don't have to be made when you're dealing with like a legacy city like Detroit. So, since then, we have been monitoring and part of the Detroit Community Benefits Ordinance since its inception. We currently sit on the city's Equitable Development Task Force, which is actively talking about how to improve the Community Benefits Ordinance. So happy to get into that. In fact, at the end, I have some like food for thought that we can get into about the CBO. We also have helped numerous community groups across the city negotiate private community benefit agreements, so even outside of the Detroit CBO. But first, I thought it would be helpful if we sort of just like kind of all checked in about nomenclature and make sure that we were using the same terms, but I think Sarah and Jeff have already like covered many of these terms. So, a community benefit plan, I view as sort of like a document that describes how developers, other stakeholders will engage the community and provide community benefits. And as Jeff noted, the federal government is requiring a lot of these plans as part of their application for, federal grants and loans, et cetera. Community benefits ordinances are where there's some sort of municipal ordinance that requires a developer to go through a process to identify these types of benefits. And as we just mentioned, for legal reasons, they are usually tied to the approval of public subsidy or some other incentives, but they don't necessarily have to be. Having said that, though, in Michigan, we have some very strict courts that have like actually struck down and taken a very conservative view of Nolan-Dolan precedent. And then last, community benefit agreements, right? I mean, this is a legally binding contract between a developer, community representatives, sometimes government bodies. And, I think the hope is that at the end of a community benefits plan or at the end of a community benefits ordinance, there is some sort of community benefits agreement. And I guess, the major point that I want to make on that is there are community benefits agreements that are led by the city. And then there are plenty of instances where the community and the developer are just reaching a contract agreement themselves. And in some ways that is sort of like the original genesis of this idea and like the original definition. It's since then has like, the movement has adapted and grown and morphed and whatnot. And as Sarah's earlier graph shows, like there are just more and more CBAs across the country. An alarming trend that we've seen at D4 as we're talking to some of our partners nationwide, however, is there's a lot more, let's call it community washing. So like, there's a lot more either city governments or developers using the word community benefits or community benefit agreements rather disingenuously. So they will sign agreements that maybe didn't have any community representatives at the table at all, right? But they're doing it sort of as a way to just kind of make their project seem better than it maybe truly is. So we can, if you'd like, happy to go into those trends as well. Yeah, I also think it might be helpful for us to sort of just like kind of take a step back and like ask a big picture question. Why community benefits, right? And I think this goes to the question that was asked earlier about, you know, exactions and contract zoning. You know, aren't normal planning, zoning approval and entitlements processes, aren't they enough? Aren't they already meant to protect the community? And I would say by and large, zoning and approval processes do help protect communities from normal externalities, right, that result from a project. However, I personally feel that if all we're doing is just mitigating negative externalities, then that's not really a community benefit, right? That is just something that the law should be doing on its own. A community benefit, to me, really is something that helps promote larger racial, social, and economic equity. And I think in every development, there is an opportunity to achieve those goals. And, you know, I think CBAs are part of this like larger movement that is thinking about development more holistically and helping to make sure that a development can be, you know, more than the sum of its parts. I think a CBA also allows some flexibility to address community concerns that aren't directly tied to land use. So for instance, the picture you see on the screen is actually my neighborhood. This is where I live in Detroit, right by the Ambassador Bridge. The Ambassador Bridge wanted to expand their customs plaza a bit, and the community did not want to see this. However, a lot of the community concerns were really about like, well, if you do this, what's to stop you from just keep on going? Like it was really a concern related to larger land speculation. So through a community benefits agreement, we were able to contractually bind them and prevent them from acquiring any more property in the neighborhood. And this is after 40 years of them just rampantly buying property and speculating. So I know today we wanted to talk about elements of community benefits planning, and so that's what this slide is meant to kind of introduce. I think whether we are talking about a community benefits ordinance, a community benefits plan, or a private CBA, these kind of 4 steps are involved in some way, shape, or form in every process. So I'll go through each step individually. The first is, I think you need to identify the community. Who is really impacted by the project that is being discussed? Are there localized impacts that need to be addressed, you know, to help the surrounding population? Or are there more global ramifications, right? Either at a citywide or regional level. Like for instance, is this a regional employment hub? Obviously, large infrastructure projects will naturally have a regional focus. And so you need to be able to kind of like identify who is being impacted at those various geographies. And then once you do that, I think it is important to also then talk about like, well, who represents those impacted communities? If it's place-based, you know, are there local community groups? Are there local NGOs that can help represent the local population? Is it issue-based? So if there is, you know, like I mentioned, you know, an infrastructure project, are there transit riders groups or transit advocates that need to be included? You know, if it is going to be a large employment center, you know, how are we talking to trade associations, labor unions, things like that? So, you know, I think I heard that Jeff is already thinking about like the multifaceted stakeholders that will be involved in his tech hub project, which is wonderful. But yeah, so I think it's really important to always be thinking critically about like who is impacted and who represents that impacted community. which, by the way, is a huge problem that we've seen over and over again with the Detroit Community Benefits Ordinance. So on the screen here, you see the impact area that was drawn for the Future of Health community benefits process. And the city, so the I should say that the planning department chooses the impact area for every community benefits ordinance process. And by law, they have to include the census tract where the project is based. So I think in this particular case, they, included the census, there were 2 census tracts that had to be accommodated, and they also grabbed in, I believe, a portion of 5326 here. The problem is like one could argue that that project maybe had larger citywide ramifications. And so the way the Detroit Community Benefits Ordinance works is 9 representatives from that impact area are selected to represent the community and negotiate on the community's behalf. But when there are larger ramifications, sometimes there are tensions there. And I think that certainly came up most recently with the Future of Health CBO. Next, I think once you've identified who is impacted and you've kind of like brought them into your coalition, it's important to prioritize the community needs. And this time and time again, we've seen not only through the CBO process, but in our like private negotiations, this is the hardest part, right? Getting a coalition of groups and people with all different values and desires to get consensus on what they are going to be asking for first is hard stuff, right? There's no easy way to do it. It just takes a lot of hard conversations and a lot of iterations, and eventually you're going to have to get there. And I think the coalitions that have done the best job at negotiating for their interests are the ones that had a really, really tight and cohesive prioritized list of what they were going to push for and what they were willing to trade off, as in any negotiation, right? Both parties never gets entirely what they want. I will say when there is a negotiation between 2 adverse parties, and oftentimes with community benefit agreements, you're talking about some sort of community coalition and a developer. I think there's 2 schools of thought around negotiating strategy. There's one that says, the community should just throw out a big laundry list of asks, right? Throw out everything you can. And that can maybe help set the Overton window in your favor. The downside, the risk, I would argue, is that it allows the developer to pick and choose what they want and what they most inexpensively can provide. And we even saw this with the Future of Health, where, the Neighborhood Advisory Committee, which is that 9-member body that I mentioned, they threw out a bunch, and the developer was able to say like, oh yeah, well, we will happily provide these things, and we're providing a majority of what you're asking for, right? So it early on painted the Neighborhood Advisory Council as like perhaps unreasonable, perhaps unfairly, I would argue. The other school of thought is for the community to really just reduce the list at the get-go and say like, here are our select priorities. And if you do not address these priorities in some way, we will be angry. So depending on the political situation and the development itself, might determine how you decide to go on that negotiating strategy. I think it's also important to then look at the project and recognize that in every project, there are some inherent or latent opportunities for community benefits. So for instance, if it's a residential project, you're always going to want to talk about affordable housing. If there is commercial or retail space, I think it's a good idea to be talking about, is there dedicated space for small, local, or disadvantaged businesses? How are we targeting hiring? I think not only can you target hiring related to local zip codes, which we've seen in plenty of CBAs around the country, but also you can target certain populations. There's a project in Oakland, California, where they were hiring hundreds of new workers. And one of the criteria that they chose to target was returning citizens, right? That was just something that the community identified as a priority. Ideally, when you're talking about targeted hiring, there is a dedicated percentage of new jobs that will go towards your specialized hiring population. Developers, at least in my experience, like are pretty loath to do that. They never really want to like sign on to a certain percentage. However, we have found that some employers are willing to give a first review. And with the Future of Health CBA, they did that as well. So they are committed to reviewing applications from the local zip codes first, and then Detroiters second, and then, the rest of the world after that. If you happen to be working on a tech or innovation hub, and Jeff, I don't know if anybody who's going to be working on that soon. I think not only should you be talking about targeted hiring, clearly you're already thinking about training and workforce development. I mean, I think that is wonderful. What you said about K through 12 education, I think is fantastic. I think there's also not only should we be thinking about how are people trained to get into jobs in the project, but once they have a job, what career pathways are we laying out so people can really go up the ladder? And for me, I always think about like, is there a janitor or is there a security guard that maybe wants to get into a more specialized position? How are we providing career pathways for them? I think there's also some really interesting opportunities, and this is a new emerging field that I can talk about, is how, are there ways that the community can actually invest in the project? So D4 is working on some ways where community members can safely invest in real estate projects and actually reap dividends as that project makes a profit. I think with, a tech or innovation hub, I mean, a question I might ask is if there are new companies or new VC opportunities, how can we use the Michigan Mile Act or some of the new federal regulation crowdfunding rules to give community residents a like safe way to invest in some of those projects and maybe profit from them? I know that's maybe a radical idea, certainly not trying to put anybody on the spot, but just throwing it out for food for thought.
Sure.
And then in any project, I think there are opportunities for local hiring and apprenticeships during construction, environmental sustainability, as well as contributions to local nonprofits and local impact funds. And then once you've, identified all of that, I think the last step is matching the needs and opportunities. And so this is also the hard part. Almost always the community will want more benefits than the developer is willing to provide or the projects can bear. So then it really becomes a question of who has the final say of what gets included in the agreement. So in the case of the Detroit CBO, Detroit City Council has the final determination in their negotiations with the developer. With a private CBA, it's whatever the community negotiating committee and the developer can successfully agree on, really. And then with the community benefits plan, Jeff, I'm not sure what the like structure will be, but if there is a steering committee, I'm sure you're already thinking about what type of community groups or other impacted stakeholders sit on the steering committee to help figure out like how do we match the community needs and the opportunities presented. So there are many types of community benefits that have been negotiated in Detroit and across the country. I will not bore you by going through all of these slides, but I mean, there's many ideas, many examples. I will pause on this one, which talks about local hiring and procurement, right? Because I think this is particularly relevant to what we're talking about. Jefferson North, this was an assembly plant. They agreed to first review for local residents. They also donated almost $8 million to workforce development programs. The Milwaukee Bucks Arena had a really robust CBA, and they said half. So they did make a commitment that half of their employees would come from targeted low-income neighborhoods within Milwaukee. They also established a labor peace agreement, which allows them to unionize if necessary. The most recent Detroit CBO is Hotel Water Square. And one of the things that we pushed for was that same sort of like union neutrality, which the developers have agreed to. And then I think there's always opportunities for local procurement. So Detroit, we have something called an Executive Order 2014-5, which calls for 30% of total contracts to be coming from Detroit-based businesses. Bedrock voluntarily committed with that. So I think in any project, we can be thinking about, how do we create a circular economy to make sure that this project is boosting up local residents as well as local businesses as well. And then the future of health, of course, is a complex project unto itself. I know it's particularly important to the people in this room. These are just some of the highlights of some of the community benefits that were negotiated as a part of that CBA. And I have to admit, it's kind of impressive. Like it really is quite a lot. And you can see that there are some things that are directly related to the project itself, such as, greater affordability for some of the residential units. There's first review hiring and job fairs and ban the box. But then there are also some things that that impact the larger neighborhood and the larger city, such as the $2 million donation to the affordable housing. I call it the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, but technically it's the Affordable Housing Development and Preservation Fund, as well as, Henry Ford will be donating land and money for a community land trust. So that's not something directly tied to the future of health development, but that was a big community need that they heard, and it was successfully provided in the CBA. So I know I'm running short on time, but this slide is just meant to illustrate like other things we've seen and other CBAs across the country. So there's a lot. Some new frontiers that D4 is working on. I think there are new possibilities to give residents more opportunities to grow with their neighborhood. So as projects come online, how are we making sure that, residents can flourish in a wealth building type of way? So as I noted earlier, there's, been some recent CBAs that brought in that provided land for community land trusts. And then also, as I noted earlier, we are doing a lot of work on community investment vehicles. So how can residents and low-income Detroiters, this is my North Star for this project, how are we safely allowing low-income Detroiters to invest in these projects? And so if you're going to do that, certain things need to be in place. There needs to be a backstop and guardrails that guarantees the principal for community residents, because as everyone knows, projects go south all the time. And low-income Detroiters probably need some favorable liquidity options as well. They also need the ability to invest nominal amounts and maybe on a monthly basis. So there are some projects that have come online across the country where community residents can invest in a development for as little as like $10 a month or $25 a month. So I think this is really important because we want to be able to find a way where Detroiters can own more of Detroit land and that they can profit from that land as it develops. Last but not least, I know there's been a lot of conversation about the Detroit CBO. I am happy to get into the ins and outs of that. I will quickly say that the Detroit CBO, where we see most of the problems, one is the Neighborhood Advisory Council. So it's a 9-member body, as I mentioned. Only 2 of them are elected by the community. The rest of the 7 are appointed by some combination of council or the planning department. And as you can imagine, and we have data to back this up, that those appointees sort of, like they run within social and professional networks, and they maybe have some incentive to not rock the boat as much as maybe the community would want them to. And then we've also seen that, the NAC they will negotiate something with the developer, and then it goes to city council for approval. And this is also where we've seen some problems arise, because inevitably other interested parties, other interest groups, equitable development advocates like D4, then we get into the mix, right? And we have some influence with city council. And so city council, at least in the past few agreements, Future of Health and District Detroit, they negotiated quite a bit more than what the NAC did. Now, we can argue and talk about whether or not we think that is fair to the developers or not, but it does create some very interesting questions related to democracy and community legitimacy and things like that, in both good and bad ways. So the Detroit CBO is one where the community negotiates and the developer really isn't sure what the community will be asking for, right? Every time we go through this path, it's something new every time. And while that customization is good, there's some other examples that I think sometimes run more efficiently that are maybe worth considering if a city were thinking about creating a CBO from scratch. So for instance, New Rochelle, New York, they have a community benefits ordinance where if you're developing in their downtown, there's a menu of community benefit options. And so and those options were created in conjunction with community, but once that menu is set, it provides the developer with a much more efficient and they would argue predictable path for how to provide community benefits. But these are all important conversations, and I really look forward to helping however I can as Lansing is taking this stuff up. And that is it. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks very much, Sam. Appreciate that. So do we have any questions in the chat room that we need to? Any questions here? We're gonna check the chat room, see if we have anything going on there that we need to bring to folks' attention. We got a few more minutes. Any questions people want to ask?
Eric, since no one's asked that question, let me just make a comment. It's to get the kind of question about where do these things come from, and is there anything kind of behind them? In our understanding, when we're trying to get our arms around it here at the center, that there seem to be like 2 directions of these things. One of them looks like to me originally started in California around issues of big scale development, where in the ways they talk about these things is that bringing the community in and doing this negotiation will streamline the development process so that goes smoother and you end up with less problems down the road. And because they were getting big delays in projects because of citizen fighting. I mean, we had that here when Sparrow Hospital on the bill across the street in their professional building. And then in the neighborhood, they went back and forth and back and forth. They finally got the building, but they also became closer to the neighborhood. They helped to create the summit that created the Allen Neighborhood Center. It's been here now 25 years and been a really important development piece for the neighborhood. And so keeping that in mind, that seeing those kind of evolve, at the local level, they evolved into ordinance based with a few of them around the country now that are starting to emerge. With the issues of accountability, enforceability, enforcement, and that kind of thing becoming more and more focused on and looking for ways to be able to create development. Now, at the federal level, well, what we've seen is that it's coming out of more of the regulatory environment related to specific departments. And Department of Energy is clearly one of them, and they brought it into the application process and into the award process where they want to see these things and you get points for how well now you constructed the benefit plans and starting to include that community voice and those perspectives in it. I've also found it though, it's in transportation, education, it's in the idea of benefits actually is, you know, whether you look at Community Reinvestment Act or other kind of housing policies, it's, we have a lot of these things that tend to want to begin to identify community benefits and in a way that there's more accountability and enforcement. Now, statewide, I haven't found, and if anybody has any information, I haven't really found anything where these things are enabled at a state level. Or at the same time, I haven't seen anywhere where they've been prevented at the state level, because they can go both ways, right? You get policy that would tell our local communities what you can or cannot do. But it seems to me like in our state, you know, with our Michigan State Housing Development Authority or the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, again, looking at the federal model, they could easily start to bring into their regulatory and awards process requirements for these kinds of interactions to take place between community and development. And I think that we'd be served well. We have some battery factory negotiations going on around the Lansing area, which are very contentious at the local level, but we're not hearing anything about really having a community benefit plan or those kind of itemized benefits to community that can be hopefully enforced. But I just want to kind of throw that out, kind of speaking to this, where do they get enabled? And so my perspective, we're seeing these emerge. It's a very emergent tool. It has a lot of potential. And I think the locals, hopefully the locals go for it really hard. The feds, if they can keep it up, but a change in administration can take that all away, right? Because those are not codified in the legislation, I don't believe. I think these are in the regulatory process. So that would be a direction that we would probably look to see, in fact, if these things end up being more and more codified and where at what level, and hopefully states joining in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, you partly can't think about this stuff without also thinking about preemption, which is an issue here in Michigan, right? I mean, like, you know, certain municipalities we can't, you know, pass certain minimum wage or prevailing wage is a different story, but like Detroit has oh my gosh, what is it called? A rent control. Detroit has a rent control ordinance on its books, right? Like the citizens of Detroit passed a rent control ordinance that is preempted at the state level. And so, you know, the state has prevented certain community benefit related ordinances from just being illegal. And I think CBAs have emerged partly in response to that as a flexible way to provide additional community benefits that avoid preemption because they are so often tied to the subsidies and incentives. And I absolutely agree with you that, like, you know, statewide, we should be doing a lot more to deliberately and in a coordinated fashion think about, are we really like asking for the right types of community benefits? Are we really, you know, seeing the right type of return on investment for some of the subsidies that we, you know, give, you know, at a statewide level?
I could weigh in a little bit on that too.
Please.
If there is a very clear path, you're going to find that more cities will enable them. And it isn't just passing along control off to another group to make the decisions on these incentives that could be nebulous and changing depending on what project comes their way. If it's very clear, and this is what we're going to do, you know, putting something like community land trust in place, this is how much is going to go to that. Facade improvement program, rental assistance, those are very clear, this is how much money, this is what it's going to. We don't have to go back to the group to ask them, is this what we wanna do? That process can be streamlined, and you know, what this is exposing and why there are community benefits plans and ordinances even being discussed, because outside investment and outside developers are pissing people off. That's what it comes down to. And it's making neighborhoods and communities angry that they've come in, done something, impacted the community, reap the benefits and leave. That's why we're even having the discussion. And to keep that from happening, this is in place to allow for everybody to benefit. And that's what should be happening in a project like this. If you're providing an incentive to developers, it should be to raise the tide of the neighborhood and the community that you live in. Otherwise, the mayor should, or whoever the city manager is, should be released. I mean, that's why you're doing this, is to improve the area around whatever the project is. And if it's isolated and it isn't improving the area around it, and it's just making people angry, then you've probably not done your job. But that's happened enough that now we need a policy.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
I was just gonna ask, is there any,
one of our advisory committee members, John gets.
is there any like plan that to try to simplify it for everybody? Like you were talking about, like if it's more understandable, like these are the thresholds. Is there any like plans or attempts to just like create a fund for community benefits, and then the advisory board and the council, they can figure out how those funds are allocated, but being able to have like some sort of easier way for the developer to say, okay, I just have to add 5% to my costs. 1% goes to art, 1% goes to affordable housing.
That's, I mean, that's what 1% of art is, right? That's, I think Sam's got a list of 40 and he's hand raised, but I think he's gonna have a list of, these are the things you could probably pick and choose from, but I don't think it's as simple as just allocating a certain percentage, because then it changes depending on who is in charge of making that determination where the 5% goes.
Right. Right.
Well, but if it goes into a fund, then everybody else can duke it out. But I also think you could also, like the neighborhood advisor, like in Detroit, it said the neighborhood advisory council and the city council had the final say, but like, then it almost seems like if you have this fund there, then it could almost be leveraged if like the community, like, I just envision, okay, let's have all the neighborhood groups, you know, create their community benefits package, what they want high in the sky. And then as developments happen or as funds come in, now maybe we can even leverage this with, can we get matching from the community foundation? Can we get matching from Michigan State? Can we get matching, you know, and be able to have a greater impact with that, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think I would call what you're describing a local impact fund, right? And so in Detroit, when Michigan Central Station and Ford were going through the community benefits ordinance, they agreed to give, I think, 750,000. I see Edwina on the line. So Edwina, please correct me if I'm wrong. But, you know, they gave 750,000 to a local impact fund, right? And part of that is that the community could decide and vote on what types of projects that money could be spent on. Similarly, in Atlanta, they tried to get a CBA related to the stadium. That campaign actually failed, but almost to appease the community, the city entered an agreement where commercial land sales around the stadium, a portion of those proceeds would go to a local impact fund that is totally controlled by the local community groups. And so that they then get to choose what to spend it on. And then last, I'll just mention that in New Rochelle, you know, I said that they have like a menu of community benefits that a developer can choose from. One of them is just a straight up financial contribution to what they call a community benefits fund. Now that's controlled citywide. And I think that has a democratic problem that Jeff alluded to, that like, that's up to then the city about how it's spent. Edwina, I see your hand raised, so please,
Yeah.
please correct me if I'm wrong, if I got something
Oh, no, perfect. And so first and foremost, good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Edwina King, and I'm currently the Associate Director of Legislative Affairs and Equitable Development for the City of Detroit's Planning and Development Department. Long title, what does it mean? We house the Community Benefits Ordinance. And so Sam, definitely, first and foremost, thank you for all the work that you do to ensure equitable development in the city of Detroit. A lot of the materials that we educate the NAC about once they've signed up or were elected for this process actually comes from, I call you guys D4. So doing development differently in Metro Detroit. So again, thank you for your advocacy. So as far as the Community Impact Fund, you did speak about Michigan Central, which was awesome because that type of fund, other CBOs, there's several CBOs within that community, and they've been able to negotiate um, kind of like, I don't want to say a sub, but um, be able to through their CBO process add to that type of fund. So that way it's able to continue. And I believe their fund is in perpetuity. We've also seen a similar example most recently with Future of Health, where the community advocated for a similar local impact fund to be utilized within those in the organizations within the impact area. And that fund was modeled after the fund that was negotiated with Michigan and Michigan Central. Another thing that we've also seen happen recently is the city of Detroit has an affordable housing ordinance. And so what we're seeing is for developers that have a housing component to their project, in addition to whatever affordability that they do. And so for those that are unfamiliar with the city of Detroit, typically if you do abatements independent of a CBO style um, abatement or a project, then there is a requirement that so many of your units be deemed affordable. What we're now starting to see is not only deeper affordability, so as opposed to the traditional 80%, we're seeing some developments go as low as 30% AMI or area median income. But what we're also seeing is contributions to the affordable housing fund, which would then allow for the city of Detroit or those who do development to create more affordable housing throughout the city. And so even if it's based off of a local CBO, again, speaking to something that or someone said it earlier, where there's a local impact, but we're able to see it trickle to other parts of the city. Because one of the things that is noticeable, and I say this in the position that I'm currently in, is most of our CBOs are kind of in 3 city council districts, with the majority of them being in 2 city council districts, which wouldn't be a problem, but for the fact that we have 7 city council districts in the city of Detroit. So we definitely want to see that impact, not only for the local community, but also to see how other Detroiters can benefit from these type of developments.
Thank you, Ms. King. Thank you for your insights. So let's thank our presenters. This has really been a very informative session. Thank you for all the work you're all doing in advancing this kind of community development work. We'll be working on a fall Thinkers and Doers event, but I think we're going to have some more work ahead with us on community benefit ordinances as well. So we'll look for you to help us think that through. So thank you so much.